Victor Ashford did not knock. He never knocked. Not at doors that he believed already belonged to him, and not at the lives of people he had already decided to own. He walked into the small boarding house room where Eliza Voss was folding the last of her mother's letters into a worn leather satchel, and he stood in the doorway with his hat still on and his lawyer standing 2 steps behind him, like a shadow with a briefcase. And he said, without any greeting, without any acknowledgement, that she was a human being standing in front of him. "You've made this more difficult than it needed to be." Eliza did not look up. She pressed the fold of the last letter flat with her thumb, the way she had done 100 times before, the way her mother had taught her to handle paper that mattered. "Get out of my room," she said. "It isn't your room. You owe the landlord 3 weeks. I've already paid it." He walked in. "That means I own the next 3 weeks of your life, Eliza. You might as well stop pretending otherwise." She finally looked at him. Victor Ashford was not a physically frightening man. He was 52 years old, lean in the way that well-fed men sometimes became when they stopped needing to work for anything, and his face had the particular smoothness of someone who had never lost a fight they couldn't buy their way out of. He wore an excellent coat. His boots were clean. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at her, not with hatred, not even with cruelty exactly, but with the flat assurance of someone cataloging an inconvenience. "You're going to sign the transfer document," he said, "today. And then you're going to come back to Helena with me, and we're going to stand in front of a magistrate and make this legal, and then your mother's foolishness stops being anyone's problem." "My mother's foolishness," Eliza repeated. "The land was never meant for her. Your grandfather lost his mind in his final years. Anyone with eyes could see it. The original deed should have transferred to my family when the debt came due in 73, and you know that." "I know no such thing." "Then you know a lie you've been telling yourself for 8 years. He stepped closer. "You're not stupid, Eliza. You've always been too smart for your own good, which is your real problem. Smart women in circumstances like yours end up alone and broke and dead in someone else's county. Marry me. Let this end cleanly." She picked up her satchel and her coat and walked toward the door. He put his hand on her arm. Not hard, not violently, just the grip of a man who had decided the conversation wasn't finished. "I will follow you," he said quietly, "to every town you run to. I have the money, and I have the patience, and I have the lawyers. You have a satchel and a bad reputation, and 34 years of people telling you that a woman your size couldn't possibly manage her own affairs. How long do you think you can keep running?" Eliza looked down at his hand on her arm. She looked up at his face. "As long as I need to," she said, and she walked out the door, and on the landing she shouldered past his lawyer without looking at him, and by the time Victor Ashford turned around, she was already on the stairs. She had $17 and a pistol and a document she had memorized so completely she could recite it in her sleep. She had a name on a letter that her mother had written 6 months before she died. Caleb Mercer. Mercer Ranch, Harlan Creek, Montana Territory. She had a train to catch. If you have ever run from something you didn't start, if you've ever been chased by a problem that wore the face of someone respectable, then you already know something about what Eliza Voss was carrying when she boarded that westbound train. And if you've ever been told that your body, your size, the shape you came in was the reason you couldn't be trusted with your own life, then you understand why she kept her hand near her coat pocket the whole 3 days she rode. Before we go any further, if you found this story, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. These stories go out every week, and I read every single comment. Tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to Eliza. She had not planned to fight anyone on the platform at Harlan Creek. That was the honest truth of it. She had planned to arrive quietly, find Caleb Mercer's ranch before anyone had time to form an opinion about her, and present herself as exactly what the letter said she was. A woman responding to a legitimate inquiry through the Hartwell Marriage Agency out of St. Louis, Missouri. She had planned to be invisible until she had a roof over her head. But the man who grabbed her arm as she stepped off the train had not received that plan, and he did not care about it. And when he said loud enough for the whole platform to hear, "She's not getting off here, she's coming back with me," and closed his fingers around her wrist and pulled, Eliza made a decision in the space of about 2 seconds. She dropped her suitcase. She reached across her body with her free hand, grabbed the man's thumb, and bent it backward in a way that was precise and deliberate and had nothing accidental about it, and when he made a sound and loosened his grip, she pulled free and stepped back and put 2 feet of platform between them and said, loudly and clearly, "Do not put your hands on me again." The man, young, somewhere in his 20s, in a jacket that was too fine for the territory and too dirty for the city, straightened up and shook out his hand and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had not expected resistance. The platform had gone quiet. Harlan Creek was not a large station. There was a small building with a ticket window, a water tower, a wagon track that ran toward the main road, and about 24 people who had found various reasons to be present at the afternoon arrival. A woman in a dark green dress stood near the wagon with 3 children around her. An older man sat on a bench with a pipe and had entirely stopped pretending he wasn't watching. 2 young cowboys leaned against the fence on the far side and nudged each other. Eliza was aware of all of them. She was aware specifically of the way their attention had organized itself around her, not around the man who had grabbed her, but around her because she was the unusual thing on that platform, the thing that didn't fit. The large woman in the travel-worn coat with the blood beginning to darken through her left sleeve where she had caught it on the door handle coming down the steps. She was aware that she was bleeding and that her suitcase was on the platform, and that she was alone in a town where she knew no one, and that the man across from her was deciding whether to try again. "You'll come," he said, "one way or another." "No," she said. "I won't." She picked up her suitcase. The man took a step. She reached into her coat. She didn't draw the pistol. She just put her hand on it clearly, so that the shape of it was visible through the fabric, and she looked at the man without blinking, and she waited. He stopped. The older man with the pipe exhaled slowly. The young cowboys had stopped nudging each other, and the man in the fine, dirty jacket looked at Eliza for a long moment, and then looked at the people around him and made a calculation, and the calculation came out the wrong way for him, and he said something under his breath and turned and walked down the platform toward the far end of the train. Eliza let out a breath. She picked up her suitcase more firmly and turned toward the small knot of people watching her and looked for any face that might match the one she had built from a letter. A man who wrote carefully, who crossed his T's lightly and pressed too hard on his periods, who described his ranch and his circumstances with a plainness that she had decided was honesty rather than limitation. There was a man standing apart from the group near the ticket window. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulder, with the kind of face that had been out in the weather for a long time. Not old exactly, somewhere in his late 30s, but weathered in the specific way of men who did their own work, and didn't have anyone to come home to, and had stopped being careful about whether they looked tired. He wore a clean shirt. That was the detail that landed. Everything else about him was work-worn and functional, but the shirt was clean, which meant he had thought about today, which meant the letter had mattered to him. He was staring at her, not the way the rest of the platform was staring at her, not with the prurient fascination of people watching a scene they didn't understand, but with a look that was trying to figure out what it was supposed to do with itself. "Are you Caleb Mercer?" she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Then marry me today," she said. "Not tomorrow, today." The silence on the platform had a different texture now. Caleb Mercer's mouth opened and then closed. He started. "I know what the letter said," she told him. "I know what I agreed to. I'm telling you the agreement needs to move faster than we planned. I'll explain everything, but not here." She looked at the far end of the platform. The man in the fine jacket was still visible, watching from near the locomotive. "Not on this platform." Caleb looked at the far end of the platform. He looked at her sleeve. "You're bleeding," he said. "I caught it on the steps. It's not serious." It's not serious," she said again, flatly. "Can we go?" He picked up her suitcase before she could stop him. Not with any flourish, not like a man performing a gesture. Just reached down and picked it up the way you pick up something that needs carrying and turned toward the wagon road and said, "Wagons this way." She followed him. Behind them she could hear the murmur of the platform crowd beginning to reassemble into conversation. The ride to the ranch was 4 miles and mostly silent, which suited Eliza. She had ridden 3 days on a train telling herself a story about how this would go. She had worked out what she would say and how she would say it and in what order she would reveal the things that needed revealing and which parts she would leave for later. She had been very organized about it in her head. Now she sat in a wagon next to a stranger who had agreed by letter to marry her and who was, she was discovering, not a talkative man, and all her prepared sequences felt like they had been arranged for someone else's situation. She looked at his hands on the reins, large hands, the knuckles a little swollen in the way that happened when you worked in cold weather long enough. He drove without thinking about it, the way you do when something is just part of your body. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. 12 years? Alone the whole time? He was quiet for a moment. "My wife died in 75. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." He said it in the way people say things they have said enough times that the words have gone smooth. It didn't mean he wasn't still sorry. It meant he had learned to carry it without putting it down. She looked at the road ahead of them. The grass on either side was the pale, dry gold of late summer, and the mountains were present on the horizon in the way mountains always were in this part of the territory, large and absolute and completely indifferent. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "I figured. I should have said it in the letter." "Maybe. I didn't because I wasn't sure you'd respond if I did." He turned and looked at her briefly, and then looked back at the road. "Are you married to someone else?" "No." "Are you carrying a child?" "No." "Are you running from the law?" "No." She paused. "I'm running from a man who believes he has a legal claim to land that belongs to my family, and who has enough money to make that claim convincing in most rooms. He followed me as far as the station." Caleb was quiet. "That man on the platform was working for him, yes." He absorbed this without changing his expression, which she found harder to read than she expected. Some men, when they heard something they didn't like, got loud about it. Some got cold. Caleb Mercer just seemed to take it in and sit with it, like he was deciding what it actually weighed before he said anything about it. "What's the land?" he said finally. This was the part she had rehearsed most. She told him about her mother, Eliza Voss, who had come west in 1859 with Eliza's grandfather and settled land in the Harlan Creek Valley before most of the territory had any official recording. She told him about her grandfather's partnership with a man named Henry Rourke, which had dissolved badly in 1864 when Rourke's son-in-law, Victor Ashford, began contesting the boundaries of the original claim. She told him about the letters her mother had kept, decades of them, tracing the original agreement and the way it had been eroded, inch by inch, through legal filings that cost more to contest than they were worth. She told him what the letters revealed about the water. This was the part she had been least sure how to say. "The original land grant covered water rights to a creek that feeds into the Harlan River," she said. "The grant has my family's name on it. The Ashfords have been filing claims on the same water for 11 years, but the original document predates their filing by 18 years. She paused. "That creek runs through your land." Caleb was very still. "My land," he said. "Yes. A creek on my land." "The water rights," she said carefully, "are a separate legal category from the land itself. That's what my mother's letters establish. My grandfather and a man named Mercer, your grandfather, I believe, were co-signatories on the original water agreement, which means you didn't come here just because I wrote a letter," he said. She didn't look away. "No." He stopped the wagon. Not dramatically, not with any violence. He just pulled the reins and the horse stopped, and he sat for a moment looking at the road ahead, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working. "You picked me," he said, "because of the water." "I picked you because the letter you wrote was the most honest thing I'd read in 8 years, she said, "and because the water rights are connected to your land. Both things are true." "That's not the same as being honest with me." "No," she said. "It isn't. And I'm sorry for that." Another silence. The horse dropped its head and cropped at something at the edge of the road. "The man on the platform," Caleb said. "If you get off this wagon and go back to wherever you came from, will he keep coming?" "Yes." "And if you stay here, he'll come here instead. So either way." "Either way, yes." He looked at her for a long time. She made herself sit still under that look, which was harder than it sounded. She had spent her whole life learning to sit still under looks. Under the ones that cataloged her size and found her lacking. Under the ones that weighed her usefulness and found her excessive. Under the ones that looked straight through her and saw property instead of a person. This look was different. It was just a man trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Which was, she thought, the most respect anyone had paid her in recent memory. The agency sent me your letter in June, he said finally. I know. I wrote 3 drafts of my response. She had not known that. I threw away the first 2 because they sounded like I was advertising livestock. He picked up the reins again. The third one I thought was honest enough to send. I didn't expect anyone to respond. I responded the same day I got it. He clicked his tongue and the horse started moving. We'll go to the magistrate's office tomorrow morning, he said. There's a man named Judge Farnell who does civil matters. He'll be there by 8. You said today, I know what you said, but if I'm going to take this on, I'm going to do it right, and I'm not dragging anyone to a civil marriage at 4 in the afternoon without at least one night to think it through. He looked at her briefly. Can you stay at the ranch tonight? There's a second bedroom. It was my daughter's. The past tense landed. She did not ask. Yes, she said. Thank you. They rode the rest of the way without talking, and she looked at the land on either side of the wagon road and tried to understand what she was seeing. It was rough country, not beautiful the way people back east described it, not dramatic in any postcard sense. It was just real. Grass and stone and the occasional cottonwood bent sideways from years of wind, and in the distance, the suggestion of a creek line marked by darker vegetation. The ranch came into view around a long curve, a main house with a covered porch, 2 barns, a corral where 3 horses moved in the late afternoon light. A dog came out from under the porch and circled the wagon without barking, which she took as a good sign. Caleb pulled up near the house and climbed down and tied the horse and reached up for her suitcase. There's a pump around the side, he said. I'll get supper started. She climbed down on her own. Her arm had mostly stopped bleeding, the wound dried and pulling now with the specific tightness of a cut that was probably going to need cleaning but wasn't going to kill her. She stood in the yard of a stranger's ranch in the late Montana summer and looked at the mountains behind the house, and she thought, I have done harder things than this. She believed it, mostly. The house was the kind of clean that came from a man who lived alone and had learned that mess was just another thing that would pile up if you didn't manage it. The kitchen was orderly in a functional way. Nothing decorated, nothing extra, but the floor was swept and the dishes were stacked and the wood box was full, which told her that he had prepared for her arrival in practical terms, even if he hadn't prepared for everything she'd brought with her. She cleaned her arm at the pump and wrapped it with a strip of cloth from the bottom of her suitcase and came inside to find him making biscuits. She had not expected biscuits. She sat down at the kitchen table because standing in a doorway watching a man cook felt stranger than just being in the room with him, and she said, How long since you used the second bedroom? He didn't look up from the bowl. 3 years. I won't ask. I know you won't. He worked the dough with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to cook for themselves because no one else was going to do it. Her name was May. She was 6 years old, fever. Eliza was quiet. My wife was already gone 2 years by then, he said. So it was just the 2 of us. And then it was just me. He punched the dough once, firmly, and began cutting biscuits. That's why the letter sounded the way it sounded. I was writing it at a kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night with nothing in the house but a dog and a lamp. She thought about the letter, the careful handwriting, the particular directness of a man who had decided that honesty was less painful than hope. I am looking for a woman who wants a plain life in a plain place. I have a working ranch and no debt and no particular talent for loneliness, though I have practiced it long enough to be competent at it. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for partnership. Partnership, she said. He looked up. That word in your letter, I read it about 15 times. It's what I meant. I know, she said. That's why I wrote back. He put the biscuit pan in the oven and wiped his hands on a cloth and pulled out a chair across from her and sat down. And for the first time since the platform, they were facing each other without motion or urgency between them. The man you're running from, he said. Ashford. What does he actually want? The water? The water rights. There's a proposal moving through the territorial legislature to establish formal water allocation for the whole Harlan River watershed, she said. Whoever holds the original rights documentation when that legislation passes controls the first claim on that water. The first claim, in a dry year, is the difference between a working ranch and a dead one. She looked at him. He's been building toward that legislation for 4 years. He's paid surveyors and bribed clerks and filed 47 separate legal actions to cloud my family's original claim. The one thing he hasn't been able to get rid of are my mother's letters and the original co-signatory document, which you have, which I have, in this satchel." He looked at the satchel on the table between them. "And you need my name on them." "I need you to acknowledge the co-signatory connection," she said. "Yes. Your grandfather Eli Mercer was one of 3 men who witnessed and signed the original water agreement in 1858. If you corroborate that relationship, the document goes from being a woman's claim that can be dismissed as sentiment to being a legal co-partnership with a documented chain of title." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the light was going golden and long, and a coyote was calling from somewhere beyond the far barn, and the dog under the table sighed and shifted. "You planned all of this," he said, "since before you wrote back." "I planned the argument," she said. "I planned what I needed and why it was legal and why it was fair. I did not plan—" She stopped. She had not intended to say the next part, but it came out anyway. "I did not plan to feel like a fraud sitting in a decent man's kitchen explaining it." He looked at her. She looked back at him and did not apologize for it because she had said what was true. "The biscuits will be ready in about 20 minutes, he said finally. "There's salt pork in the pan if you want to start on that." She got up and started on the salt pork. They cooked together in the kitchen without any more big declarations, and the dog came out from under the table and sat near the stove, and the coyote called twice more and then went quiet. And outside the window, the last of the light went sideways and orange and then dark. She would think about that evening for a long time afterward, not because anything particular happened in it, but because it was the first time in years she had been in a room where nobody was looking at her as a problem that needed solving. She was just a woman in a kitchen making supper with a man she didn't know yet. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. It was, she realized, exactly what she had been running toward. They were married at 8:47 in the morning in the office of Judge Clarence Farnell, who had a head cold and smelled of camphor, and who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done it many times and considered it roughly equivalent to notarizing a deed transfer. There were 2 witnesses. One was the judge's clerk, a thin young man named Aldous, who signed his name in large, careful letters and seemed genuinely moved by the proceedings, which nobody had asked him to be. The other was a woman named Ruth Candler, who ran the dry goods store 2 doors down and had been recruited off the sidewalk because the judge needed 2 witnesses, and Eliza and Caleb between them knew nobody in Harlan Creek well enough to ask a favor of. Ruth Candler was approximately 60 years old and had the handshake of someone who had been lifting supply crates since before Eliza was born, and she looked at Eliza with an expression that was not unkind and said, "Honey, you've got blood on your sleeve." "I know," Eliza said. "Thank you." "You want me to look at that after?" "I'm fine." Ruth Candler looked at her in the way of a woman who had heard that particular sentence from other women enough times to know exactly what it was worth. But she signed the document and shook both their hands and went back to her store, and Aldous the clerk filed the paperwork with the specific satisfaction of a young man who believed in the significance of official documents. And Judge Farnell blew his nose into a large handkerchief and told them they were legally married and wished them good health in a tone that suggested he considered good health someone else's department. Caleb held the door for her on the way out. They stood on the sidewalk in the morning light, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Well, Caleb said. "Well," Eliza said. He had brought the wagon around. He untied the horse and climbed up, and she climbed up beside him, and they rode back toward the ranch in the same silence they had established the evening before, which was by now starting to feel less like awkwardness and more like something they had agreed to without discussing it. "I need to go to the land office," she said, when they were out of town and back on the wagon road. "Today, if possible. I need to file the co-signatory document with the water rights annexation. I know where the land office is. I'd like to do it before Ashford knows I'm here." "He probably already knows you're here," Caleb said. "That man on the platform yesterday. He'd have wired Helena last night." She had known this. She had told herself it didn't matter, that she had a plan and the plan was good, but hearing it said plainly by someone else made it sit differently in her chest. "How long does it take a man like Ashford to get from Helena to Harlan Creek?" she asked. "By train and wagon?" 2 days if he moves fast." He looked at her sideways. "You've got today and tomorrow morning, maybe." She did the arithmetic. "Then we go to the land office first and the general store second. I need ink and paper, and I need to make 3 copies of the original document before I file it. 3 copies. 1 for the filing, 1 for my satchel, 1 to be held by a third party in the county. If Ashford has any way to get at the filed copy, I want another one somewhere he can't reach. Caleb thought about this. Ruth Candler, he said. I don't know her. She's been in Harlan Creek since before the county existed. Her husband built the first building on Main Street. She doesn't like men who push women around. I watched her refuse service to a man last spring for speaking badly to his wife in her store. Eliza thought about the woman who had noticed her sleeve, who had offered to look at it without making a performance of the offer. Would she do it? She asked. Hold a document for someone she just met? Ask her. She'll either say yes or she won't. He paused. She's harder to buy than the average person. That's worth something. They went to the land office first. The land office in Harlan Creek was run by a man named Dobbins, who had the particular quality of bureaucrats in underfunded territorial offices, simultaneously overworked and deeply committed to the importance of correct procedure, as though procedure were the one thing keeping the whole enterprise from sliding into the river. He examined Eliza's documents with the slow care of a man who did not intend to be hurried, and when she explained the co-signatory relationship between the Voss land grant and the Mercer water agreement, he looked up over his glasses and said, "You'll need the current deed holder to confirm." My husband is the current deed holder," Eliza said. Dobbins looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. "Eli Mercer was my grandfather. I've seen the original water agreement. My grandfather kept a copy." He paused. "I can get it." This was news to Eliza. She kept her face still. "How soon?" Dobbins asked. "Few days. It's in a box with some other papers at the ranch." Dobbins made a note. "I'll hold the filing open pending that corroboration. You've got 10 days before the window closes." He looked at Eliza. "Mrs. Mercer, I should tell you. There are already 3 competing claims on the water rights registered to a Harlan Creek Water and Land Company, filed in March." "Who holds that company?" she asked. Dobbins adjusted his glasses. "The registered agent is a Silas Crow." The name was new to her. She looked at Caleb, who had gone very still beside her. "You know that name," she said. "Everybody in the valley knows that name," he said. He thanked Dobbins and put his hand lightly on Eliza's arm and steered her toward the door. And once they were outside on the sidewalk again, he said, in a voice he was keeping carefully level, "Silas Crow owns the 2 largest ranches east of the creek. He's been buying land in the valley for 6 years. Anybody who won't sell, he finds another way." He looked down the street without seeing it. "I've had 3 fences cut in the past year, lost a calf last November that I couldn't prove anything about. My neighbor Ed Farley sold out in April and moved his family to Oregon and wouldn't say why." Eliza stared at him. "You knew there was someone pressuring the valley." "I knew there was someone. I didn't know his company was involved in the water rights." His jaw tightened. "Ashford and Crow. That's not a coincidence." "No," she said. "It's not." She was already reshaping what she had thought she understood about this. She had come here thinking Victor Ashford was the problem, a singular personal enemy with a specific grievance. But a land company with an established agent meant capital, meant lawyers, meant a network that had been operating in this valley for years before she ever arrived. They're working together. Or they have been. Or one of them is using the other. Caleb looked at her. "Does Ashford know Crow?" "I don't know. I didn't know Crow existed until 4 minutes ago." He rubbed the back of his neck. It was the first genuinely uncertain gesture she had seen from him, and it was strangely reassuring, not because uncertainty was comfortable, but because it was real. "We need to find out how deep that connection goes before Ashford gets here. Once he's in the valley, everything moves faster than we want it to." "Agreed." She looked down the street toward the dry goods sign. "Ruth Candler first. Then you tell me everything you know about Silas Crow." Ruth Candler said yes. She said it without particular drama, sitting behind her counter in the mid-morning quiet of her store, listening to Eliza explain what the document was and why it needed to be held somewhere secure. She asked 2 questions. The first was whether the document was legally obtained, and Eliza said yes and explained the chain of title. The second was whether this would bring trouble to her store, and Eliza said honestly that she didn't know, but probably yes eventually, and Ruth Candler was quiet for a moment and then said, My husband built this store in 1863, and I have been running it since 1871 when he died. And in that time I have had 3 separate attempts by men with money to buy this building out from under me. I am still here." She reached out her hand for the document copy. "I'll put it with my property deed in the strongbox. Nobody gets into that without going through me first." Eliza handed it over. Ruth tucked it under the counter without ceremony and said, "You want to tell me what's actually happening in this valley?" "I'm still figuring that out myself," Eliza said. "Then figure it out fast. Silas Crow had 2 of his men in here last week buying rope and asking which ranches had changed hands recently." She looked at Eliza steadily. "That's not a man who's waiting to see what happens." They went back to the ranch. Caleb found the box his grandfather had kept in the back of the bedroom closet, a tin box, dented and dusty, that hadn't been opened in at least a decade by the look of it. He pried the lid with a penknife and went through the papers at the kitchen table while Eliza sat across from him with her mother's letters spread out in order of date. The grandfather's copy of the water agreement was there. It was older than hers, the paper thicker, the ink faded at the edges, the signature different from the notation in her mother's letters because it was the original hand rather than a copy. But the language matched, the names matched, the date matched. Caleb set it down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "He never mentioned this," he said. "My grandfather. I never heard the word water rights from him my whole life." 1858 was a long time ago. If there was never a challenge on it, there was never a reason to explain it. There was reason. Ed Farley's land backs up to the same creek. He tapped the document. "If this covers what you say it covers, Ed had rights here too," and he left. Eliza looked at the paper. Did anyone explain to him why? Ed's not a complicated man. Someone with money made him an offer, and then made it clear what would happen if he didn't take it. Caleb's voice was flat. He's got a wife and 4 kids. He took the offer. She thought about the shape of it. A land company filing water rights claims through a registered agent, fences cut. A neighbor driven off his land. A woman chased across 3 states to prevent a document from being corroborated. All of it converging on the same creek, the same watershed, the same piece of territorial legislation moving through a committee in the capital. "How many ranchers are still in the valley?" she asked. He thought about it. 8, not counting me. 3 of them have been here as long as I have. The others came in the last 5 years. He paused. The 3 long ones, Jim Holt, Pete Danvers, Thomas Reyes, they've all had trouble with Crow's people. Jim had a barn burn last spring, called it lightning. Nobody believed it. Do they talk to each other? Some. Men out here don't exactly sit around sharing their problems. But they know. He looked at her. What are you thinking? She was thinking that she had come here with a personal problem and a personal solution, and the personal solution was suddenly looking very small against the actual size of the thing. She was thinking that her mother's letters and her grandfather's document had seemed like enough when it was just Ashford, but Ashford and Crow together was a different order of problem. She was thinking that she had married a man she didn't know, in a county she didn't know, and she was about to ask him to help her fight a fight that had just gotten considerably larger than advertised. I'm thinking I need to meet Jim Holt and Pete Danvers and Thomas Reyes, she said. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Why? Because they have the same problem I have, and they don't know it yet. And because 8 ranchers who understand what's happening are considerably more useful than 1 woman with a document and 1 man with a tin box. He was quiet. I know, she said. I came here for my family's claim. This is bigger than that now. It got bigger the minute Crow put his name on that company filing, Caleb said. He wasn't arguing. He was thinking. She could see the difference. The legislative window on the water allocation, she said. How much do you know about it? Enough to know it matters. Not enough to know when. My contact in Helena, a woman named Caroline Marsh who worked for the committee secretary, told me the vote is scheduled for November. That's 4 months. She looked at the documents on the table. Ashford has been working this for 4 years. Crow has been working the valley for 6. They've built toward this vote very carefully. The one thing they didn't build around is this document because they didn't know it existed until I started asking questions in Helena last year. That's when they started following you. That's when it escalated, yes. Before that it was legal filings and pressure. After that it was a man following me onto a train platform. She touched the edge of her mother's letters. My mother spent 30 years keeping these. She knew what they were worth. She just didn't live to see how worth it they'd be. He looked at the letters. He didn't say anything. She appreciated that. The not saying anything, the just letting it be what it was. "I'll send word to Jim Holt tomorrow morning," he said. "He'll talk to the others. It'll take a few days to get everyone in the same room." "Good." She began gathering the documents carefully. "And the copy of your grandfather's agreement. We should file that with Dobbins tomorrow morning with the corroboration. The sooner it's on official record, the harder it is to make disappear." "I'll go first thing." He watched her handling the papers with the focused care of someone for whom those pages were not abstractions. "You know this by heart." "Every word." She folded the last letter. "My mother read them to me when I was 8 years old. I thought it was bedtime stories. She was making sure I'd remember." He was quiet for a moment. "My daughter liked stories," he said. Then he got up from the table and put the kettle on, because apparently that was the kind of man he was, the kind who moved when feeling got too large to sit with. She didn't follow that thread. There was time for that later, or there wasn't, and right now there were more urgent things. The urgent things arrived the next morning. Not Ashford. He was still at least a day away if their timing was right. It was one of Crow's men who showed up at the edge of the property line just after dawn, while Caleb was at the corral and Eliza was on the porch with her coffee, a rider who came up the wagon road at a pace that was deliberately unhurried in the way that was meant to say, "I go where I want on this road." And he stopped his horse about 30 feet from the porch steps and looked at her. He was young, mid-20s, with the particular blankness of someone who had learned that expression was a disadvantage. He was not carrying a weapon she could see, which did not mean he wasn't carrying one. "You'd be the new wife," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Mr. Crow sends his regards," the man said. "Wanted to welcome you to the valley personally. He's having a gathering at his place this Saturday. Caleb Mercer is on the invitation list. Wanted to make sure the invitation extended to the new Mrs. Mercer as well." "How considerate," Eliza said. "Mr. Crow is a considerate man. I'll pass the invitation along to my husband. He hopes you'll come." The man's eyes moved over the porch, the house, the yard, in the way of someone making notes. "He also wanted you to know that the valley has been very peaceful lately. He works hard to keep it that way." "I imagine he does," Eliza said. The man looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable and then turned his horse and rode back down the road the way he had come, unhurried, not looking back. Caleb came around from the corral, with hay still on his shirt, and looked at the retreating rider. "How long was he here?" 3 minutes. She looked at her coffee. "Crow's having a gathering Saturday. We're invited." Caleb's jaw set. "That's not an invitation." "I know what it is." She looked at the road. "We should go." He turned to look at her. "If we don't go, he knows we're afraid," she said. "If we go, we see his property, we see who else is there, we see how he operates in front of an audience." She looked at Caleb. "Men like Crow are very comfortable in rooms they've set up themselves. I want to see him in that room." "It could also be a way to get us somewhere he controls when Ashford arrives," Caleb said. "Yes." She finished her coffee. "That's why we filed the corroboration with Dobbins this morning and meet with Jim Holt before Saturday." He looked at her for a long moment. She had a feeling he was revising something. Not about the plan, but about her. Not badly. Just updating the version of events he had constructed based on the letter and the platform and the wagon ride. She understood. She was updating her version of him, too. "I'll hitch the wagon," he said. They were at Dobbins' office when it opened at 8. The clerk filed the corroboration and gave them a receipt with a date stamp and a registration number, and Eliza put the receipt in the satchel alongside everything else and thanked him with enough warmth that he straightened his collar, and they were back on the street before 9. Jim Holt's place was 6 miles east along the creek road, a working ranch that was older than Caleb's and showed it, not in disrepair exactly, but in the accumulated character of a property that had been modified a dozen times as needs changed. Holt himself was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a gray beard and a way of standing that suggested he had made his mind up about most things a long time ago and was not in the habit of revisiting them. He listened to Eliza explain the situation from the porch steps. He listened to all of it: Ashford, the water rights, the land company, the legislative vote, the co-signatory document. He listened without interrupting, which she had not expected, And when she was done, he turned and spat off the side of the porch and said, "My barn burned in April, not March. March is when the fence line went." "I know," she said. "Caleb told me. I had a man coming out here 3 months ago offering to buy at a number that wasn't offensive. I said no. 2 weeks later, my best horse came up lame and I couldn't prove anything." He looked at Caleb. "You think this water business is why?" "Makes sense now," Caleb said. He was already buying who he could buy and pressuring who he couldn't. If the water rights get consolidated under his company, when the legislation passes, every ranch in the valley either sells to him or dries out. Holt worked his jaw for a moment. Pete Danvers lost a calf to something last summer. Tom Riaz had his hired hand quit without reason after 15 years. Little things. Enough to feel, but not enough to prove. He looked at Eliza. "What's the document do exactly?" She explained it again, more precisely. The original grant, the co-signatory relationship, the window with Dobbins, the way a properly filed claim would predate everything Crow's company had registered. "And the woman who burned you was Ashford's target to start," Holt said. "Yes. But Ashford and Crow are connected. I don't know exactly how yet." "Money," Holt said. "That's how those men are always connected. One's got the legal piece and the other's got the boots on the ground." He scratched his beard. "I'll talk to Pete and Tom. Give me 2 days." He looked at Eliza with the measuring look of a man who was revising his assessment of a situation. "Your husband know you're this organized?" "He's learning," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite dry humor, but was in the neighborhood. They rode home with the sun already high and the heat beginning to press down on the grass on either side of the road. Eliza sat with the satchel on her lap and watched the creek line in the distance and thought about her mother, who had kept letters for 30 years and read them to a child at bedtime and died before she knew whether any of it would amount to anything. She thought about what 30 years of patience looked like, laid out in a tin box and a leather satchel. She thought about the vote in November, 4 months away, and the 2 men converging on this valley from different directions with more money and more lawyers and more history in this territory than she had. She thought about Jim Holt's burned barn and Pete Danvers's lame horse and Tom Reyes's hired hand who quit after 15 years, and the way all of it added up to a pattern that the men living inside it had felt but hadn't been able to name. "They'll come Saturday," she said, "to Crow's gathering, all of them." "Probably," Caleb said. "Good. I want to see which ranchers he's comfortable around. That'll tell me who he thinks he's already won." She felt Caleb look at her sideways. "The woman I wrote that letter to," he said. "I had a picture in my head of who would answer it." "And?" "And she was a lot quieter," he said. It was not a complaint. It was not even quite a statement. It was more like a man noticing something and deciding what to make of it. "I'm sorry to disappoint," she said. "I didn't say disappointed." She looked at the road ahead of them, at the mountains beyond and the pale dry grass and the afternoon building its slow heat above everything. She was tired. She was more tired than she had let herself acknowledge since she'd stepped off that train. 3 days of travel and a fight on a platform and a wedding and a full morning of document filings and a 6-mile ride to a stranger's porch, and underneath all of it the constant low hum of calculating what came next and what came after that. She was 34 years old and she had been running from something for 2 years and fighting it for 8, and the fight was not over, was in fact about to get considerably louder. But the wagon was solid under her and the road was straight, and Caleb Mercer was driving with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and the satchel was on her lap with everything that mattered inside it, and for just a few minutes she let herself stop calculating and just rode. "You should look at your arm tonight," he said. "Properly." "It's fine." "You said that yesterday too." "It's still fine." "Eliza." He said her name like it was a sentence on its own. She looked at her sleeve. The bandage had bled through at some point during the morning and dried again. "Fine," she said. "Tonight." "Thank you," he said, dry as the grass. She looked at him. He was watching the road. She found herself thinking unexpectedly about the letter. About a man at a kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night with a lamp and a dog. About 3 drafts and 2 thrown away, and one that got sent into the world without much hope of return. She had written back the same day she got it. She hadn't told him why she'd done it so fast. Not the part that was true, anyway. She'd said it was the word partnership, and that was true. But it was also the part about no particular talent for loneliness. which was the most honest line she had read in a long time, because it said the thing that people usually dressed up in something better looking. No particular talent for loneliness. She knew exactly what that felt like. She was still knowing it when they came around the long bend in the road and the ranch came into view again. The house and the barns and the corral and the dog coming out from under the porch, the same as it had the day before. And she thought, 2 days until Ashford gets here, maybe less, and Saturday until Crow's gathering, and a November vote on something that would shape this whole valley's future. 4 months. A lot could happen in 4 months. A lot already had. Ashford arrived on a Thursday. Eliza knew it before she saw him. She was at the kitchen table copying the last of her mother's letters into a clean notebook when the dog got up from the floor and went to the door and stood there without barking, which was different from how he acted when it was a stranger, and different again from how he acted when it was someone he knew. It was the particular alertness of an animal that had decided something required attention, but hadn't decided yet what kind. She went to the window. There were 2 horses coming up the wagon road. One carried a man she didn't recognize, broad, dark-coated, the kind of hired size that Victor Ashford had always preferred to travel with. The other carried Ashford himself, sitting a horse the way men who had learned late in life sat horses, with the careful posture of someone performing competence rather than having it. She watched him come up the road. She had known him for 8 years. She had feared him for 6 of those and understood him for 2, and the understanding had not made him less dangerous, only more legible. He was not cruel for the pleasure of it. I was the more common kind of bad man, the kind who had decided that his desires were reasonable, and therefore anyone standing between him and his desires was the problem. He had decided that about her mother first, then about her. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch steps and stood in the doorway, and Ashford reined his horse and looked at her across the yard with the expression of a man who had expected this and was not impressed by it. "You look well," he said, "all things considered." "Get off my property," she said. "I believe the deed is in a Mr. Caleb Mercer's name." "My husband's property. Get off it." Ashford dismounted without hurry and handed his reins to the man beside him and walked to the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. He did not come up the steps. That small hesitation was the only acknowledgement he would make that she was standing on ground that wasn't his. "I heard about the wedding," he said. "Congratulations. I imagine it was quick." "What do you want, Victor?" "I want what I've always wanted. I want the document and the letters, and I want this ended." He looked around the yard with the evaluating eye of a man calculating worth. "I've had a conversation with Mr. Dobbins at the land office. He was very forthcoming about recent filings." Her stomach tightened. She didn't let it show. "Dobbins isn't authorized to discuss pending filings with third parties," she said. "He was persuaded otherwise." Ashford looked back at her. "The co-signatory corroboration is clever. Your idea, I assume. The Mercer connection. You've always been good at finding the angle that looks legitimate." He put one foot on the bottom step. "Here's the problem, Eliza. Even with the corroboration, what you've filed is a claim on historical water rights in a county that currently has 3 formally registered active users of that same water source. My lawyers will contest the historical precedents. That takes 8 months minimum, more likely a year. Your window to influence the November vote closes in 4 months. He tilted his head. "You're not ahead of me. You never were." She stood still in the doorway and looked at him and thought, he's right about the timeline, but he came here himself, which means the filing worried him more than he's showing. "You rode 2 days to tell me I'm losing," she said. "That seems like a lot of effort." "I rode 2 days to make you a final offer." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Sell me the document and the letters for $800 and withdraw the corroboration filing. I'll have you and your new husband on a train to wherever you want to go, and you'll never see me again." $800 was real money. She knew he knew that. She also knew what he would do with the document once he had it, and what would happen to the 8 ranchers in this valley when the November vote passed, and Crow's Water Company controlled every drop of water in the watershed. "No," she said. His face did something small and controlled. "Eliza, I said no. And the next time you come on this property without an invitation, I'll have the county sheriff out here with you. My husband knows the sheriff personally." This was not entirely true. Caleb had mentioned the sheriff's name once in passing, but Ashford didn't know that. He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. He looked at her for a moment with the look of a man storing something away for later. "You've made this harder than it needed to be every step of the way," he said. "I hope your husband understands what he married into." "He does," said Caleb from behind her. She had not heard him come in from the barn. He was standing in the hallway behind her with his work gloves still on, and the particular stillness of a man who had been listening for at least the last 2 minutes, and had decided this was the moment to stop listening. Ashford looked at him with the assessment of a man who had bought and sold other men's work his whole life. Caleb looked back at him with nothing readable on his face at all. "Mr. Mercer," Ashford said, "I want you to understand the position you're putting yourself in. This is a legal dispute that predates your involvement by nearly a decade. Your name is now attached to a filing that will be contested in territorial court, and the contestation will cost money you may not have and time you cannot get back. Your ranch, your land, your livelihood, all of that becomes collateral to someone else's fight." "My grandfather's name is on the original agreement," Caleb said. "That makes it my fight." "Your grandfather signed a document in 1858 that your family has ignored for 23 years. My family didn't know it mattered until someone started trying to take it." Ashford was quiet for a moment. He looked from Caleb to Eliza and back to Caleb, and Eliza could see him recalculating, not retreating, never that, but finding the next angle. "I'll be in Harlan Creek through the weekend," he said. "The offer stands until Monday morning." He turned and walked back to his horse, not quickly, not as if he were leaving, just as if he had finished what he came to do. He mounted without looking back. "Think carefully," he said, and rode back down the wagon road with his hired man behind him. They stood on the porch and watched him go. "Dobbins talked," Eliza said. "Dobbins was always going to be the weak point," Caleb said. "Money in a territorial land office goes a long way." He peeled off his gloves. "Was any of that a surprise?" "The $800. He hasn't offered money before. He's always used pressure." She watched the two riders diminish down the road. "He's more worried than he's showing." "That's what I thought." He held the door for her and they went back inside. "Saturday's the gathering. You still want to go?" "Now more than ever," she said. Silas Crow's property was the kind that made other ranches feel provisional. It was not just larger, though it was that substantially. It was the self-conscious largeness of a man who wanted the size to be the first thing you noticed, who had built not for function, but for statement. The main house had a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and both sides, and the barns were painted, which almost nobody in the territory bothered with, and the fencing was new enough that it still smelled of cut wood. There were about 30 people at the gathering by the time Caleb's wagon came up the drive. Eliza recognized Jim Holt's bulk near the far end of the yard and caught his eye briefly and saw him tip his head in a way that meant he'd seen what he needed to see. Pete Danvers was there, a thin man with a sunburned neck who stood with his arms crossed and looked like a man waiting for a conversation to be over before it started. Thomas Reyes stood near the fence with 2 other men she didn't know. She also saw Victor Ashford. I was standing near the house's front steps, talking to a man she had not met but knew immediately. Silas Crow was in his late 50s, the kind of man whose weight had redistributed itself from muscle to solidity over the years, with white hair and the clothes of someone who had money long enough that good clothes had stopped feeling like dressing up. He had the particular ease of a man on his own property, surrounded by people he considered his, and he watched Eliza climb down from the wagon with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and told her nothing whatsoever. "The Mercers," he said, coming forward with his hand out. "Welcome. I'm glad you could make it." He shook Caleb's hand first, then turned to Eliza, and when he took her hand, he held it a moment longer than necessary and said, "I've heard quite a bit about you, Mrs. Mercer." "I imagine you have," she said pleasantly. "All interesting." He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had been useful for a long time. "Come, have something to eat. I want you to feel at home." She did not feel at home. She felt like a woman walking into a room where most of the pieces had been arranged before she arrived, and she paid attention to everything, to the way Crow moved among his guests, touching a shoulder here, leaning in with a quiet word there, the specific choreography of a man managing a room he controlled. To the way Ashford stayed near the house and did not mingle, which told her that his role here was not social. To the way the men from the valley, Holt and Danvers and Reyes and the others, stood in a loose separate cluster that Crow visited but did not quite join. He had not won those men yet. That was useful. She spent the first hour eating and watching. Caleb stayed close without being obvious about it. Twice she saw him speak briefly to Jim Holt, angled in a way that looked like casual ranch talk. Once she caught Pete Danvers looking at her with an expression that had moved past skepticism into something closer to assessment. Then Crow brought Ashford over. "I believe you two are acquainted," Crow said, with the tone of a man who considered himself generous for acknowledging this. "We are," Eliza said. Ashford looked at her with the flat civility of a professional. "Mrs. Mercer, I hope you've had time to consider what we discussed." "I have," she said. "My answer is the same." "That's unfortunate." He looked at Caleb. "For both of you." "Victor," Crow said, with a mild restraint that was itself a form of power, the kind that reminded the person being restrained who was in charge. Ashford stepped back slightly. Crow looked at Eliza with the same pleasant expression he had worn since she arrived. "I want to be direct with you, Mrs. Mercer, because I think you're a direct woman, and I respect that. What you've filed with Dobbins is going to cause a complication. Not an insurmountable one, but a complication. I don't like complications. I've spent 6 years building something in this valley that works for everybody. Ranchers, families, the county. Water management is part of that." He paused. "I'm prepared to offer your family's original claim a formal recognition in the water allocation agreement, a percentage of the rights, clearly documented, in exchange for withdrawing the competing claim and allowing the November legislation to proceed without legal contest." It was a better offer than Ashford's $800. She had to acknowledge that, at least internally. A percentage of the rights was real, was something, was more than she had started with 8 years ago. "What percentage?" she asked. 8. She looked at him. "The total allocation covers 12 ranches and the county water supply," he said. 8% is proportional to the original land grant acreage. "The original claim is a co-signatory on the primary source water," she said. "That's not 8%. That's a foundational position. You know that." He studied her for a moment. The pleasant expression had not changed, but something behind it had shifted, the faint recalibration of a man who had expected a different kind of conversation. "You've done your reading," he said. "My mother spent 30 years on those letters," she said. "I've had them my whole life. I know what they say." "Then you know what the legal challenge will cost." "Yes, I do." She held his gaze. "Do you know what it will cost you if the challenge succeeds? If the original co-signatory claim is upheld, the Harlan Creek Water and Land Company's 3 registered filings become secondary in precedence. Every contract you've already written with downstream users gets renegotiated. Your November vote becomes an argument instead of a formality." She paused. "That's not a complication, Mr. Crow. That's a problem." Crow looked at her for a long moment. Ashford said nothing. Somewhere behind them, someone laughed at something, and a child ran across the yard, and the normal sounds of a Saturday gathering continued as though nothing particular was happening near the house steps. "I'd like you to come inside," Crow said. "Let's talk about this properly." "I'd prefer to stay out here," she said. Something moved through Crow's eyes. Not anger, not quite, but the thing that came before anger in men who weren't used to being told no in their own yard. He managed it. He was very practiced. "All right," he said. "Then let me be plainer. I have contracts with 4 downstream users that are already signed and registered. I have a relationship with 2 members of the territorial legislature. I have surveying records and 3 years of water usage documentation. What you have is a paper from 1858 and a dead woman's letters." He said it without cruelty. That was the thing. He said it the way you state the weather. "I don't want to fight you in court because fighting you in court takes time. But I will. And the longer this takes, the more it costs everyone, including the men in this valley who just want to run their ranches." She heard this. She heard it clearly. She also heard, underneath it, the thing he wasn't saying. He was including the valley ranchers in the cost because he wanted her to feel responsible for them. He was making them her burden, counting on her to feel the weight of 8 families and fold under it. "You've already been costing the men in this valley," she said. "Jim Holt's barn, Pete Danvers' horse, Tom Reyes's hired hand, Ed Farley's family." She kept her voice level. "That's not water management, that's pressure. And those men know the difference even if they haven't said so to your face yet." The pleasant expression was gone now. It wasn't replaced by anger exactly. It was replaced by nothing, by the blankness of a man who had been in enough rooms to know that showing his actual reaction was never useful. "You don't know what you're starting," he said quietly. "I know exactly what I'm starting," she said. "I've known for 2 years." She turned and walked back toward the yard, toward the cluster of valley men, toward Jim Holt's solid bulk, and Pete Danvers's crossed arms, and Thomas Reyes's careful watching eyes. Caleb fell in beside her. He said nothing. She was grateful for that. She stopped near Holt and Danvers and Reyes, and 2 men she had not met, and she said, quietly and directly, "I need all of you at Caleb's place Monday morning. I need an hour of your time, and I need you to bring anyone else in the valley you trust. I'll explain everything, but I need you to hear it before the end of this week." Holt looked at her. Then he looked past her toward the house steps where Crow was standing watching them. "Monday morning," Holt said. 8 o'clock, she said. Danvers uncrossed his arms. "I'll be there." Reyes looked at the 2 men beside him, who nodded. She thanked them and turned away, and Caleb touched her arm briefly. Just a contact, just a confirmation, and they went to collect the wagon. They didn't speak much on the ride home. The afternoon was tilting into evening, and the light was going that particular golden horizontal that made the valley look like something that deserved to survive. And Eliza sat with the satchel on her lap and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who had just lit a fuse and was now waiting. Caleb spoke first. "Crow's not going to wait for Monday." "I know. If he's going to move, it'll be tonight or tomorrow. He'll want to cut off the conversation before it happens." "What does that look like for him?" Caleb thought about it. "He doesn't come directly. He's not that kind. He'll send someone to have a word with Holt or Danvers. Maybe offer something. Maybe apply pressure. He'll want to make them think twice about sitting in my kitchen. Can he turn them? Holt? No, Danvers, I don't know. He's got a wife who's been wanting to leave since the barn fire. Reyes," he shook his head. "Reyes has been here 20 years. He's not going anywhere." He paused. "The 2 men with them I didn't recognize." "Newcomers," she said. "Within the last 5 years, you said." "Might be his already, might not be. Hard to know." She looked at the road ahead. "We locked the documents up tonight. Both copies at the ranch, the original set in the satchel, your grandfather's copy in the tin box. All of it together in one place where we know it is. And Ruth Candler's copy. Ruth Candler's copy stays where it is. She's the insurance we don't touch, unless everything else goes wrong." She shifted the satchel on her lap. "If Ashford or Crow gets someone inside Dobbins' office before Monday, the filed copy could be challenged. It's happened before. I've seen it in Helena. A document goes in, and a week later the registration number doesn't appear in the ledger, and the clerk doesn't recall the transaction." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You think Dobbins is that viable?" "I think we already know. He talked to Ashford about a pending filing that he shouldn't have discussed. Yes, I think he's that viable." He absorbed this. The wagon rolled on over the dry grass road, and the mountains held the last of the light on their upper edges, and the valley floor went into shadow. "When we get home," he said, "I'm going to check the fence line on the east pasture. Crow's man came from that direction when he visited." She looked at him. "Practical," he said. It wasn't defensive. It was just the way he thought, in concrete steps, in things you could actually do. She thought about the way he had stood in the hallway behind her when Ashford was on the porch steps. The way he had said, "My grandfather's name is on the original agreement." He could have stepped back from that. He could have let her take it. He hadn't. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her briefly. "When I chose to write back to your letter, I want you to know that I read all 3 parts of what you wrote 3 times before I picked up a pen. The part about no talent for loneliness. That's the part that decided it." He looked at the road. "I meant what I wrote." "I know you did. That's why it worked." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I had 4 other women write back to the agency, before you." She had not known that. "None of them felt—" He stopped. "Honest," he said finally. "They felt like letters trying to become something before there was anything to become." "Yours felt like the thing itself," she said. "Yeah." He was quiet. "Well." She almost smiled. The ranch came around the bend, and the dog ran out from under the porch, and Eliza climbed down from the wagon and went inside while Caleb unhitched the horse, and she put the satchel on the kitchen table and lit the lamp and sat down and looked at everything that had happened in 5 days. She had arrived in a county she had never seen with a wound on her arm and a man trying to pull her back onto a train. She had married a stranger in front of a sick judge and a woman who noticed blood on sleeves. She had filed documents and met ranchers and walked into the lion's den and told the lion exactly what she thought of his den. She was tired in a way she hadn't been since her mother died. The bone-deep kind that wasn't just physical, that came from holding a position for a very long time without any certainty it was going to hold. She opened the satchel and checked every document in order, the way she had done every day for 2 years. They were all there. She was on the last letter when she heard the first shot. It came from the east pasture, distant but clear in the evening quiet, and she was on her feet before the sound had finished, the satchel closed under her arm and her other hand finding her coat on the hook by the door, and she was out on the porch and looking toward the dark line of the east fence when she heard the dog bark, once, sharp, and then Caleb's voice calling from somewhere beyond the barn. She could not make out the words. She went down the porch steps and around the barn and found Caleb at the edge of the east pasture, standing over a cut fence line, with his rifle in his hands and the smell of fresh-cut wire in the cold evening air. 3 of his cattle had already moved through the gap and were disappearing into the dark. "How many?" she asked. "1 shot. Warning, I think. Nobody there now." His voice was controlled, but his hands were tight on the rifle. "They cut about 20 feet of fence." She looked at the cut wire and at the dark pasture beyond. "They want you out here," she said. "In the dark, away from the house." He looked at her quickly. "It's what I would do," she said, "if I wanted someone away from the house." They were both moving before she finished the sentence, back around the barn and across the yard at a pace that was not running but was close to it. And when they came around to the front of the house, there was a figure on the porch. Not Ashford. Not one of Crow's riders. A woman, slight and young, standing with her arms wrapped around herself, and the particular posture of someone who has just walked a long way and is not sure of their welcome. She turned when she heard them coming, and in the lamplight from the window, Eliza could see that she was perhaps 20 years old with a bruise along her jawline that was 2 days old from the color of it. "Are you the woman from the land office?" she said. "The one who filed the water claim?" "Yes," Eliza said. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara Dobbins," the girl said. "I'm the clerk's daughter. My father told Mr. Ashford about your filing on Wednesday, and Mr. Ashford gave him money, and then on Thursday my father came home and told me what he'd done, and he's been sick about it since." She swallowed. "He sent me to tell you that Mr. Crow's man came to the office today, while my father was at lunch. He went through the registration ledger." Eliza went cold. "Is the filing still there?" she asked. "When my father got back, the registration number was still in the ledger," Clara said. "But the original document that was left for filing, the one with your signature and your husband's signature." She stopped. Her jaw was working. "It was gone." Eliza stood in the yard of her husband's ranch in the dark of a Saturday evening and looked at the girl in front of her, and she thought about everything she had thought was ahead of her. Monday morning, the Valley Ranchers at the kitchen table, 4 months until November. She had planned for pressure. She had not planned for this to move so fast. Then she thought about Ruth Candler and the strongbox under the counter. She thought about Caleb's grandfather's tin box. She thought about the notebook on the kitchen table where she had been copying her mother's letters that morning, letter by letter, word by word. The way her mother had taught her to handle paper that mattered. She took one breath. "Come inside," she said to Clara Dobbins. "Tell me everything your father remembers." Clara Dobbins sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk and told them everything she knew, which was more than Eliza had expected and less than she needed. Her father had been clerk at the Harlan Creek Land Office for 11 years. He was not a bad man, Clara said this carefully, the way daughters say things about fathers they have complicated feelings about. He was a man who had gotten into debt 3 years ago when the roof of their house collapsed and the repairs cost more than he had, and a man named Garrett, who worked for Crow, had come around at the right moment with a short-term loan at reasonable terms, and the terms had not stayed reasonable. And by the time her father understood what he had agreed to, he was already owned. "He didn't want to tell Mr. Ashford about the filing," Clara said. "He came home that night and he couldn't eat. He just sat at the table." She looked at the coffee. "But Garrett came to the office the day before and reminded him what would happen if he stopped being useful." "What did Garrett say would happen?" Eliza asked. "He said the loan would be called due. All of it at once. We'd lose the house. She paused. He also said something about my father's other records, that if anyone looked carefully at the filings from the last 3 years, there might be irregularities. She said this last word with the specific flatness of someone repeating something they had memorized. My father doesn't know exactly what Garrett meant. He's afraid to find out. Caleb was leaning against the wall near the stove with his arms folded. Who went through the ledger today? A man named Pruitt. He works for Crow. My father has seen him before. She looked at Eliza. He took the original filed document, the one with both signatures. My father didn't see him do it. He came back from lunch and it was gone. But Pruitt was the only one in the office while he was out. The registration number is still in the ledger, Eliza said, thinking through it. That means the filing exists on record as having occurred. What's missing is the source document. Without the source document, the registration can be challenged as incomplete. In territorial procedure, an incomplete filing can be voided within 30 days. They have 30 days to act on it, Caleb said, but we have the same 30 days. She looked at the satchel on the table. We have the copy Ruth Candler is holding. We have your grandfather's original agreement. We have my copied notebook. She thought. The question is whether we can use copies to restore a primary filing. Can we? I don't know territorial procedure well enough to be certain. We need a lawyer. She looked at Clara. Your father, would he testify that the original document was properly filed? That he processed it himself? Clara was quiet for a moment. He'd lose his position, she said. He might. He might also be prosecuted for the irregularities Garrett mentioned, depending on what those are. I can't promise you otherwise. Eliza kept her voice level. But I can tell you that if Crow and Ashford get what they want out of the November vote, your father's position in that land office becomes worthless anyway. A man who has already been used once is easy to use again and easier to discard. Clara looked at her hands. He knows that, she said quietly. That's why he sent me. Eliza looked at Caleb. He looked back at her with the expression she was coming to recognize, the one that meant he had already reached the same conclusion and was waiting to see if she'd get there. I need to go to Helena, she said. When? Tomorrow, first train Monday morning. She began organizing the papers in the satchel. There's a territorial court clerk I know, a woman named Margaret Sills, who worked for the committee that's handling the water allocation bill. She knows the procedure. She'll know whether a certified copy can substitute for the original in a filing restoration. That's 2 days there and back, Caleb said. Monday's meeting. You hold Monday's meeting without me. She looked at him. You know what needs to be said. Crow pressured them individually because they were isolated. Put them in the same room and let them compare what happened to each of them. They'll do the rest themselves. He was quiet. I know it's a lot to ask, she said. It's not that. He pushed off the wall and came to the table and sat down across from her. If you're in Helena and something happens here, nothing's going to happen in 2 days. Eliza. He said it the same way he had said it about her arm. Just her name, carrying the weight of a sentence she hadn't finished yet. She looked at him. She had been moving fast since the moment Clara showed up on the porch, and she had not slowed down to feel the shape of the situation, which was something she did when things got difficult, had always done, kept moving so the fear couldn't find a foothold. She made herself slow down now. You're right that it's a risk, she said. If Crow moves before I get back, he won't move on the ranch directly, Caleb said. That's not his way. He'll work through lawyers and Dobbins and pressure, the physical stuff, the fences, the barn fires. That's been to make people feel watched, not to actually destroy anything yet. He paused. What I'm saying is I'd feel better if you weren't on a train alone. Clara looked up from her coffee. I can go with her, she said. Both of them looked at her. She straightened slightly under the attention. My father's cousin lives in Helena. I was going to visit in September anyway. And if you need someone who can carry documents without looking like she's carrying documents, she gestured at herself, slight and young and unremarkable. Nobody's going to look twice at me. Eliza studied her for a moment. The bruise on her jaw. The way she had walked however far it was from town in the dark to bring a warning to strangers. The specific kind of courage that wasn't dramatic but was real. The kind that showed up and did the practical thing. All right, she said. We leave on the 6 o'clock. She spent Sunday preparing. She made 3 additional copies of the key documents. The original land grant notation, the co-signatory list, the specific clause, about primary water rights, in her clearest handwriting, and she labeled each one and wrapped them separately and distributed them through the satchel and her coat lining and Clara's traveling bag in a way that meant no single theft would get all of them. She wrote out for Caleb, in plain language, exactly what she needed him to say to the Valley Ranchers at Monday's meeting. Not a script. Caleb would not use a script, and she knew it. But the facts laid out in order, the shape of what Crow had been doing and why it mattered, and what the November vote meant for every ranch in that valley. He read it over at the kitchen table while she cooked. "You write like a lawyer," he said. "My mother made me read every document she ever received twice before I was allowed to ask a question about it," she said. "I learned to think in plain language because she required it." He set the paper down. "Jim Holt's not going to need convincing. Danvers is the one I'm worried about." "Why Danvers specifically?" "His wife." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Martha Danvers has been pushing him to sell for a year. If Crow or Ashford got to her before Monday, can you talk to her directly?" He thought about it. "Ruth Candler knows her better than I do." "Then ask Ruth." She turned from the stove. "Ruth Candler is the most credible person in this county right now. If she tells Martha Danvers what she knows, Martha Danvers will stop pushing Pete to sell." He nodded slowly. "I'll go to her first thing Monday before the meeting." They were quiet for a while. The dog was under the table. The lamp was low. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the grass with the sound that always made the territory feel both vast and very close. "If Margaret Sills can confirm the copy procedure," Eliza said, "I'll need to bring back a certified affidavit from the territorial court. That's the cleanest path to restoring the filing without starting over." "How long does that take?" "If Margaret can get me in front of the right clerk on Tuesday, I could be back by Wednesday evening." 3 days. 3 days. She looked at him. "I know it's fine," he said. And then, "It's not fine, but it's necessary, so it's fine." She looked at him across the kitchen. She had known him for 8 days. 8 days was not enough to know a person. She understood that clearly. But she was beginning to understand the shape of him, the way you learned the layout of a house in the dark by moving through it carefully, by knowing where the solid things were. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. She wanted to say something adequate to the situation, which was that she had arrived at his ranch 8 days ago as a practical arrangement, and somewhere in those 8 days it had become something she didn't have a clean word for yet. She wanted to say that she had not expected him, specifically, that she had expected competence or at least willingness, but not the particular quality he had of being exactly as much as he said he was, and no more and no less. What she said was, "Keep the rifle near the door." "Already planned to," he said. She almost said the other thing. Instead, she served the food, and they ate, and Clara slept in the second bedroom, and the dog stayed under the table, and the wind moved through the grass all night. She was on the 6 o'clock train with Clara beside her and the satchel on her lap, watching Harlan Creek fall away behind the locomotive, when she finally let herself feel how tired she was. Not the physical tiredness, though that was there, but the tiredness of holding a position for a long time under sustained pressure, of calculating and recalculating and moving and adjusting and not allowing herself the particular luxury of doubt. She allowed it now, in small measure, watching the territory move past the window. She might be wrong about Crow's timeline. He might move faster than she thought. The ranchers might not consolidate the way she hoped. Margaret Sills might not be able to help. The copy procedure might not hold up in territorial court. Dobbins might be more compromised than his daughter knew. She let herself think each of these possibilities straight through to the end instead of stopping at the edge of them, and then she put them back where they lived and looked at what she had. She had a registration number in a ledger, a copy of the original document in Ruth Candler's strongbox, a grandfather's original agreement in a tin box under Caleb's kitchen table, a notebook full of her mother's letters copied in her own hand, a land office clerk's daughter sitting next to her who was braver than she looked, a husband holding a meeting she couldn't be at. She had, she decided, enough. Not more than enough. Not comfortably enough. But enough. Helena in September was a different city than the one she had run from in July. Or maybe it was the same city, and she was different. She had not been a married woman when she left, had not had a county and a ranch and a legal filing and a fight of this particular scale organized around her. The city felt smaller than it had, which she understood was a function of what she was carrying rather than any change in the city itself. Margaret Sills worked in a building 2 blocks from the Capitol that smelled of old paper and wood polish, and she opened the door to her office and looked at Eliza for a long moment and then said, "I heard you'd gone west," and stepped back to let her in. Margaret was in her mid-40s, a thin, precise woman who had been in territorial administration long enough to have seen most of the ways power moved in this part of the country, and who had developed, as a consequence, the specific quality of being unshockable. She listened to Eliza explain the situation from the beginning without interrupting, and when it was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Silas Crow." "You know him," Eliza said. "I know his name on every water allocation submission that's come through this office in the past 4 years." Margaret looked at her steadily. "I know that the Harlan Creek Water and Land Company's registered agent is also the brother-in-law of the committee member who schedules the vote." She paused. "I didn't have enough to do anything with that. Until now, possibly." Eliza looked at her. "Tell me about the brother-in-law." "Senator Aldrich Webb. He's been on the Water Committee for 3 years. He controls the calendar." Margaret tapped her desk. "The November vote date was set by Webb. Can it be contested?" "The date itself? No. But if there's a pending legal challenge to one of the registered claims in the allocation, a formal challenge with documentation filed in territorial court, the committee is required by procedure to defer the vote until the challenge is resolved." She looked at Eliza. "That's the procedure. It exists. Webb can't override it without exposing himself." Eliza sat with this for a moment. "If we restore the original filing with a certified copy and then file a formal challenge to the Harlan Creek Water and Land Company's claim on the grounds of primary rights precedents, that triggers the deferral." "Yes, but you need the restoration first. And you need it filed in territorial court, not just in Dobbins's ledger." Margaret folded her hands. "The copy procedure is legitimate. A certified copy presented with an affidavit from the original clerk and corroborating documentation can substitute for the primary document in a restoration filing. I can write you the procedural citation. How long does the restoration take once filed? 7 to 10 days for the court to process. Then the challenge can be filed immediately after. The challenge itself, how long does that hold the vote? Until the challenge is resolved, which, in a case with this much documentation," Margaret looked at her, and something in her expression had changed from professional to something more personal. "Eliza, if you can put the co-signatory claim, the original grant, the grandfather's agreement, and the corroboration in front of a territorial judge, you're not just holding up a vote. You're making a case that could restructure the entire water allocation for that watershed." "That's what I intend." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "They're going to fight very hard." "I know. Crow has money and time and connections in this building." "I know. And I have 30 years of my mother's letters and an 1858 co-signatory agreement and 8 ranching families who've had their fences cut and their barns burned and their hired hands driven away." She looked at Margaret. "And I have a land office clerk's daughter who walked in the dark to warn us, and a woman named Ruth Candler with a strongbox, and a husband who is holding a meeting right now that I couldn't be at." She paused. "I have enough." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a sheet of paper and began writing. She wrote for 20 minutes. When she was done, she blotted the page and handed it across the desk. It was a procedural citation letter, detailed and precise, on territorial administration letterhead, outlining the exact copy restoration procedure and citing 3 previous cases where it had been successfully used. "Take this to Clerk Harmon on the 3rd floor," Margaret said. "Tell him I sent you. He can process the restoration filing today if you have everything you listed." She had everything she listed. She spent 4 hours in the territorial court building, moving between offices with Clara beside her, waiting in corridors, answering questions from clerks, signing affidavits, providing documentation. Clara turned out to be remarkably good at waiting. The particular skill of someone who had spent a lot of time in rooms where they were not quite seen, who had learned to be patient and to watch and to speak at exactly the right moment and not before. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the restoration was filed and processed. The registration number in Harlan Creek's ledger now had a corresponding primary document in the territorial court record. It could not be voided. It could not be removed. It was as permanent as paper and procedure could make anything. Eliza stood in the hallway outside Clerk Harmon's office and looked at the receipt in her hand and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for 2 years. "Is it done?" Claire asked. "This part," Eliza said. "Yes." They filed the formal challenge the following morning. It was 3 pages of precise legal language that Margaret had helped her draft the evening before, citing the co-signatory precedents, the 1858 grant, the Mercer corroboration, and the procedural irregularities in the original Harlan Creek Water and Land Company filings. The challenge named Silas Crow as respondent. The clerk who processed it was a young man who read the document twice and then looked up and said, "This triggers a committee deferral on the November water vote." "Yes," Eliza said. "I know." He stamped it with the particular satisfaction of a man who loved procedure being followed correctly. By the time they were on the Wednesday morning train back to Harlan Creek, the challenge had been officially logged in the committee calendar, and Senator Aldrich Webb's office had received formal notification of the deferral. Margaret had sent word of this to Eliza at her boarding house the previous evening by way of a note delivered by a young man on a bicycle, and the note said only, "Webb is not happy. Crow has been informed. Come home carefully. Come home carefully." She looked at that word, home, and thought about what it meant that it fit now in a way it hadn't a week ago. The train ride back was longer than the train ride out had felt. She was tired and the seat was hard, and Clara fell asleep across from her with her head against the window and looked approximately 12 years old, and Eliza sat with the satchel and watched the territory unreal outside and thought about Caleb holding a meeting she hadn't been at. She thought about what Jim Holt would have said, what Pete Danvers would have looked like sitting at a kitchen table hearing the full shape of what had been done to the valley, what Thomas Reyes, 20 years on his land, would have felt when he understood that the hired hand who had quit without reason had been persuaded to leave. She thought about whether Caleb had remembered to put out enough chairs. She thought about the dog under the table. She thought about 8 days being not enough to know a person and also somehow being enough to know certain things clearly. That he meant what he said, that he didn't perform emotions he wasn't having, that he picked up suitcases because they needed carrying and not because he wanted credit for it. She was thinking about this when the train slowed for the Harlan Creek station and the platform came into view, and she saw Caleb standing near the water tower with his hat in his hand, not because it was a formal occasion, but because he had a habit of taking it off when he was paying attention to something. He was paying attention to the train. She was off the platform before Clara had gathered her bag, and Caleb saw her and his face did something she had not seen it do before. Not quite relief, because that implied he had been more worried than she'd known, which he was, but something adjacent to it, something honest. "How'd it go?" he said. "The restoration is filed. The challenge is in. The November vote is deferred." She looked at him. "How was the meeting?" "Holt's in, Reyes is in. Both men from the gathering you didn't know, Kellerman and Price, they're in. Danvers," he paused. "Martha Danvers sat in on the meeting. Ruth Candler came with me in the morning and talked to her before the men arrived. By the time Pete heard everything, he was angrier than anyone in the room." He looked at her steadily. "He's in." She let that settle. 6 ranching families. 6 sets of land, water, livestock, years of work, reasons to stay. All of them now in the same room, hearing the same truth, deciding together instead of separately. "Crow knows about the challenge," she said. "Margaret sent word. He was notified Tuesday." Caleb nodded. "He sent a man out here Tuesday evening, left a message with the note that the offer was withdrawn." Of course it was. The offer had only ever been an attempt to stop the challenge from being filed. Now that it was filed, the offer was worthless to him. "What else?" "Ashford left Monday morning. Didn't come back." He looked at her. "That surprised me." It surprised her too. She turned it over. "He's gone to consult with Crow. The challenge changes their legal position significantly. They need to regroup," she thought. "Or Ashford is cutting his losses. If Crow's the bigger player here, Ashford may decide that the personal vendetta isn't worth the exposure." "Can you count on that?" "No," she said. "But it's possible." She looked at the station around them, the quiet afternoon platform, the wagon road, the mountains holding the sky. What about Dobbins? Claire's father came in Monday morning and made a formal statement to the sheriff about Pruitt taking the document. The sheriff is a careful man. He didn't arrest anyone, but he's got the statement and Pruitt can't come back to the county without answering for it. He paused. Dobbins also gave a sworn affidavit about the original filing. Clara's father. He stopped. Something moved across his face. He's not a bad man. No, she said. He isn't. Clara had come up behind them and she looked at Caleb and said, "Is he all right?" "He's scared," Caleb said honestly. "But he did what he needed to do." Clara nodded. She looked older than she had on the train, or maybe Eliza was just seeing her differently now. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, with the afternoon going long and golden around them, and Eliza told Caleb everything. Margaret Sills, Senator Webb, and his brother-in-law, the 3 previous cases. The clerk who had loved the procedure, the note that said, "Come home carefully." He listened to all of it. He asked 2 questions, both specific and practical. He did not say anything about the scale of what she had done or perform any particular admiration for it, which was the right response. Not because it didn't matter, but because they both knew it mattered, and saying so wasn't going to add anything to the knowing. "The legal challenge will take time," she said. "Months, probably. Crow will fight it. He has the money and the connections. But it buys time. It buys time and it changes the ground. He can't move the vote. He can't void the filing. Every move he makes now is reactive instead of strategic." She looked at the road. "He's been building toward November for years. We've just made November into something he has to defend instead of collect." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Ed Farley," he said, "my neighbor who sold and went to Oregon." She looked at him. "If the water rights get properly established, if the co-signatory claim holds, Ed's land is part of the original watershed. He had rights that were being suppressed, same as everyone else. He sold under pressure from a man who was taking something from him." He didn't say anything more than that, just looked at the road, but she heard the whole sentence underneath. "I know," she said. "We'll need to establish whether the sale can be contested. That's a separate legal question, but yes, that's a person," he said. "A family. Not just a legal question." "Yes," she said. "It is." They pulled into the yard and the dog came out, and the September evening was coming down cool and clear, and Eliza climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at the house and the barns and the mountains behind them and thought about what it would take to actually win this. Not just delay it, not just complicate it, but win it cleanly enough that Crow couldn't find another angle and Ashford couldn't find another year. It would take the ranchers holding together. It would take Dobbins' affidavit and Clara's courage and Ruth Candler's strongbox and Margaret Sills's procedural citation and her mother's 30 years of letters. It would take a territorial judge who respected precedent. It would take time that none of them had to spare, but all of them had to find. It would take, she thought, everything she had and some things she didn't have yet. Caleb came around from the barn where he'd tied the horse and stood beside her in the yard, looking at the same mountains. "You should eat something," he said. "You haven't eaten since the train." "You can't possibly know that. You eat when you're not solving problems, and you were solving problems the whole way back." "I know." He turned toward the house. "There's beans on the stove from this morning." She looked at the back of him walking toward the door. The clean shirt, the work-worn everything else. The dog trotting at his heel. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. She crossed the yard to where he was standing, and she did the thing she had not done the night before the train because there hadn't been a word for it yet. She took his hand. He looked down at their hands and then up at her, and he didn't say anything, which was exactly right. "Thank you," she said, "for holding the meeting, for the ranchers, for all of it." "It's my valley too," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "I mean, thank you for trusting me with it." He turned his hand and held hers, not tightly, just the way you hold something that matters and that you're not sure yet you have the right to hold. "The beans are going to be terrible," he said. "I overcooked them on Sunday, and they've been sitting." "I've eaten worse," she said. "I know you have." He held the door and she walked in, and the lamp was already lit on the kitchen table, and the satchel went on the chair, and the dog settled under the table, and the mountains held the last of the light outside the window while they ate terrible beans and talked about what came next. The beans were terrible, and neither of them mentioned it again. What they did talk about over the next 3 days was strategy. Not the large dramatic kind, but the granular, procedural, unglamorous kind that actually determined outcomes. Who would carry the ranchers' consolidated statement to Helena? Which of Margaret Sills's contacts on the water committee could be approached without alerting Webb? whether Dobbins' affidavit was strong enough on its own or needed to be supplemented by Clara's testimony, whether Ed Farley in Oregon could be reached by letter in time to matter. Caleb wrote to Ed Farley on Thursday evening, 4 pages in his plain, careful handwriting explaining everything. He did not ask Eliza to read it before he sealed it. She did not ask to. She understood that some things were between a man and the neighbor he hadn't been able to help in time, and that those things deserved their own space. She wrote to Margaret Sills the same night. 2 pages, tightly organized, laying out the next phase of the challenge and what she needed from the territorial court. They sat at opposite ends of the same kitchen table and wrote their separate letters in the lamplight while the dog slept under the table and the wind worked at the corners of the house. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and also, Eliza thought, exactly what partnership actually looked like when you stripped away the sentiment. 2 people in the same room, working on the same problem, from their own separate angles. The response from Crow came not through a writer or a message, but through a lawyer. His name was Edmund Fitch, and he arrived in Harlan Creek on a Friday morning and presented himself at the land office, and then at the sheriff's office, and then, having apparently established that the proper channels were not going to serve him quickly enough, came out to the ranch on Friday afternoon in a hired wagon with a leather case on his lap and the particular expression of a man who had been sent to deliver a threat in legal language. He was not unpleasant. That was the thing about men like Fitch, that they were professional in the way that made you understand that the unpleasantness was nothing personal, just business, which was somehow worse than if it had been personal. He sat across from Eliza and Caleb at the kitchen table and opened his case and laid out 3 documents and said, "My client is prepared to file a counter-challenge to the restoration filing on the grounds that the copy submitted lacks primary authentication under the Territorial Evidence Statute of 1874. That statute requires that a substituted document in a land rights restoration be authenticated by 2 independent witnesses to the original filing, not 1. He looked at Eliza. Mr. Dobbins was the sole witness. Your husband's signature on the original is not sufficient as a second independent witness, as he is a party to the claim. Eliza looked at the document he had placed in front of her. She read it carefully. She read the cited statute. She read the specific language of the authentication requirement. Then she looked at Fitch. "Who else was present at the original filing?" she asked. "That's your problem, Mrs. Mercer, not Aldous," Caleb said. She looked at him. "The judge's clerk. At our wedding. His name was Aldous, and he was at the land office that same morning when we filed the corroboration." He looked at Eliza. "He was there when Dobbins processed it. I remember because he was the one who stamped the receipt, and he did it with both hands like it was important." Eliza turned to Fitch. "The clerk Aldous was present at the filing as an employee of the county court, which makes him an independent county official rather than a party to the claim. Under the 1874 statute, a county official present at the time of filing qualifies as an independent witness." Fitch looked at his document. "I'll need to verify that interpretation," he said. "Margaret Sills in the Territorial Administration Office can verify it for you," she said pleasantly. "She's the one who provided the procedural citation. She's very thorough." Fitch closed his case. He was not a man who showed frustration, but something around his eyes had tightened. "My client is also prepared to challenge the 1858 grant on the grounds that the original land survey predating it used methodology that has since been superseded and is no longer considered legally definitive under current territorial. The survey methodology challenge was attempted in the Gillette Water case in 1877 and rejected by the Territorial Supreme Court on the grounds that retrospective technical standards cannot void prospective legal agreements made in good faith under the law of the time." She looked at him. "If your client files that challenge, he will lose it, and the loss will establish precedent that strengthens the original claim rather than weakening it." Fitch was quiet. "Mrs. Mercer," he said after a moment, "you are not a lawyer." "No," she said. "I'm a woman who has been reading her family's legal documents for 26 years. He picked up his case and stood. "My client's position remains that a negotiated settlement is preferable to prolonged litigation," he said. This was a retreat dressed as a door left open, and all 3 of them knew it. "My position remains that the original claim is valid and the challenge is filed," she said. "If your client wants to negotiate, he can address the court." Fitch left. Caleb looked at her across the table. "Aldous," she said. "I need to go talk to Aldous." "Aldous? whose full name was Aldous Finch, and who had indeed processed the filing receipt with both hands because he considered it important, was delighted to provide a witness affidavit. I was the kind of young man for whom legal procedure was a genuinely held value rather than a professional obligation, and the idea that someone had stolen a document from the land office and that his affidavit might help remedy this filled him with the specific satisfaction of a person doing exactly the thing they were made to do. He signed the affidavit the same afternoon and insisted on having it notarized immediately, which required going to Judge Farnell's office, where the judge had a better cold than the last time they'd seen him, but was still using the large handkerchief. "You again," Farnell said to Eliza, not unkindly. "Me again," she agreed. The affidavit went to Margaret Sills by the Monday post. Crow's counter-challenge was filed the following Wednesday and rejected by Thursday afternoon on exactly the grounds Eliza had cited. She heard about this from Clara, who had stayed in Harlan Creek with her father rather than going to Helena, and who had developed a precise and efficient method of gathering information from the county court office in the way of young women who were not considered worth watching. Clara came to the ranch Thursday evening with the rejection notice and put it on the kitchen table with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been useful. "My father wants to know if there's anything else he can do," she said. Eliza looked at the rejection notice and thought about it. "Tell him to keep a record of everything, every person who comes into that office, every question that gets asked, every time someone lingers near the files, not written in the official ledger, a separate personal record. Date, name, what they asked, what he said, in his own handwriting." She looked at Clara. "If this goes to a territorial court hearing, a contemporaneous personal record from the land office clerk is significant evidence." Clara nodded. "He'll do that." After she left, Caleb stood at the stove making coffee and didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "How many people are working on this now?" Eliza thought about it. Margaret Sills, Aldous, Clara and her father, Ruth Candler, Holt, Danvers, Reyes, Kellerman, Price and their families, the sheriff, you. She paused. "And Ed Farley, if he writes back." Ed Farley wrote back in October, 3 weeks after Caleb had sent the letter. It came on a Tuesday when the first real cold of the season was pressing down from the mountains, and Eliza was at the kitchen table working through the next stage of the legal response, with a cup of tea going cold beside her. Caleb came in from the yard with the mail and set the letter down in front of her without saying anything, and she looked at the Oregon postmark and then at him. He sat down and opened it. She watched his face while he read. It was a complicated face to read. She had gotten better at it over the weeks, but it was still not easy, which she had come to understand was not a barrier between them, but just the shape of him, a man who processed most of what he felt internally first and externally second. But she saw it when he got to whatever the important part was. A slight opening around the eyes, something releasing. He put the letter down and slid it across to her. Ed Farley was coming back. He had retained a lawyer in Portland with Eliza's letter as the basis for a potential sale contestation claim. I was not certain it would succeed. His lawyer had been honest about the difficulty, but he was coming back to give testimony about the pressure campaign that had preceded his sale, and he was bringing his family, and he wanted to know if there was anyone in the valley who needed a good hand because he'd been working a cousin's farm in Oregon, and it wasn't his land, and he knew the difference. Eliza read the letter twice. She thought about a man who had sold his land under pressure and gone to Oregon and worked someone else's farm for 5 months, and known, every day, the difference between someone else's land and his own. She thought about what it cost him to come back, not just the journey, but the admission that he had left, which in this country at this time meant something particular to a man's sense of himself. She thought about her mother, who had not lived to see any of this, but whose letters were the reason any of it was possible. She put the letter down. "He's coming home," she said. "He's coming home," Caleb said. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for the second week of December, which gave Crow's legal team 8 weeks to build their case and gave Eliza's side 8 weeks to build theirs. It was not, as legal timelines went, a lot of time. It was enough. Margaret Sills coordinated the documentation from Helena. Eliza organized the Valley Ranchers' testimony, not collectively, not as a group statement, but individually, each family's specific experience laid out in sworn affidavit form, specific dates and specific events and specific losses. Holt's barn in April, Danvers's horse, Reyes's hired hand, the fence cuttings on Caleb's east pasture, the writer who had come to survey the property before the gathering, The message from Crow's man about the valley being peaceful and Crow working hard to keep it that way. She sat with each of them and asked them to tell it plainly, the way it had actually happened, without embellishment and without minimizing. Most of them were not comfortable with the writing things down part. Most of them were very comfortable with the telling what happened part. Jim Holt came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in October and sat at the kitchen table and told Eliza about the barn fire with the specific flatness of a man who had told himself the official story enough times that the real story had gotten compressed underneath it. She let him tell the official story first. Then she asked him what he had actually thought when he saw the fire. And he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I thought, I know who did this, and I can't prove it, and my wife cried for 2 days, and I didn't know what to do with any of that." "That's what I need you to say," she told him. "Exactly that." He looked at her. "Not the official version," she said. "The true one. A judge who has heard 1,000 official versions can tell the difference." He wrote it down. It took him a long time, and he scratched out several starts, and Eliza did not help him with the words because they needed to be his words, but she stayed at the table while he worked and refilled his coffee twice. When he was done, he looked at what he'd written and said, "It's not very formal." "Good," she said. Pete Danvers brought Martha to the ranch. Martha Danvers was a small, precise woman who had been wanting to leave the territory for reasons that had nothing to do with Crow and everything to do with the territory itself. The cold, the isolation, the specific loneliness of a woman in a place built for people who preferred their own company. She had wanted to leave, and Crow's pressure had given her a reason that was easier to say than the real one. Eliza understood this without Martha saying it. What Martha said instead, sitting across from Eliza while Pete was in the yard talking to Caleb, was, "I told Pete to sell because I wanted to go. That's the truth. But what Crow's man said to Pete at the fence line that September, what he said about what would happen to the water, that wasn't Pete's imagination, and Pete didn't tell me all of it because he didn't want me to be more scared than I already was." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to say that, in the affidavit, that Pete wasn't wrong about what he heard, and I wasn't wrong about wanting to leave, and neither of those things cancels the other out." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 2 months," she said. "Will you write it exactly that way?" Martha Danvers wrote it exactly that way. Crow made 2 more attempts before the hearing. The first was through Fitch, who came back in November with a revised settlement offer. Not money this time, but a formal recognition of the co-signatory claim with a guaranteed 12% of water rights and a written withdrawal of all pressure on Valley ranchers going forward. It was a real offer. Eliza took it to the kitchen table and laid it out and sat with it and was honest with herself about what it was. 12% was real. A written withdrawal was real. It would end the hearing, end the uncertainty, give the Valley something concrete and documented. She brought it to the ranchers. They sat in Caleb's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. 6 families, some of them in chairs, some of them standing against the walls. And she laid out the offer and what it meant and what the alternative meant, and she did not tell them what to decide. Jim Holt spoke first. "What happens to Ed Farley's contestation if we settle?" "It becomes independent of our claim," Eliza said. "He can still pursue it, but without the primary challenge supporting it, it's a weaker case." Holt was quiet. Thomas Reyes said, 12% of rights on water that the original document gives us primary claim on. That's them keeping 88% of something that was ours first." "Yes," Eliza said. "That's accurate." Pete Danvers looked at his hands. "What do you think?" She had not intended to say what she thought. She had intended to let them decide. But Pete Danvers had asked her directly, and she had learned in the past 3 months that there was a difference between not imposing your opinion and hiding it when someone needed it. "I think 12% of something you were given 100% of is a settlement that benefits the person who stole from you," she said. "I think the offer came now, 2 weeks before the hearing, because they've looked at the documentation and they know they're going to lose. I think we should go to the hearing." She paused. "But it's your land and your water and your families, so it's your decision." The room was quiet for a moment. "Hearing," Holt said. Danvers nodded. Reyes said, "Hearing." Kellerman and Price said it together without looking at each other. Caleb, who had not spoken, said, "Hearing," last, and looked at Eliza, and the look was the one she had learned meant he had already known what he thought and was glad she'd said it. The second attempt was less procedural. Two of Crow's men came to the east fence line on a Thursday night in November, and this time they did not just cut wire. They drove off 11 of Caleb's cattle into the dark. By the time Caleb found the gap in the morning, the cattle were gone and the tracks were rained over, and proving anything was going to be difficult. He came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and told her. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the flat expression of a man holding something hard very carefully. "All right," she said, "go tell the sheriff. Today, not tomorrow. Going now." "And Caleb?" He stopped in the doorway. "This is them being afraid of the hearing. You understand that. They wouldn't bother if they weren't afraid." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "Doesn't make it easier to know." "No," she said, "it doesn't." The sheriff, whose name was Tom Briggs, and who had been careful and steady throughout all of this without being either reckless or cowardly, took the report and went out to the fence line himself and came back with photographs made by a new camera he had acquired in September and measurements of the gap and a cast of a boot print that had been protected from the rain by an overhanging piece of cut wire. The boot print matched a pair belonging to Pruitt, the same man who had taken the document from the land office. Briggs had Pruitt's boot size from the earlier investigation. He filed the connection with the county record and sent a copy to the territorial marshal's office and said to Caleb quietly, "I've been waiting for something I could use." Pruitt was arrested on a Friday, a week before the hearing. He did not give up Crow directly. But the arrest was public, and the charge was filed under Crow's registered company name because Pruitt was employed by it, and that connection was now in the county record and would be in the territorial record within the week. Crow did not send anyone else. The hearing was on a Tuesday in the second week of December, in the territorial court in Helena, in a room with high ceilings and wooden benches, and the particular cold of a building that was heated inadequately in a cold climate. Eliza had been in the room since 7 in the morning, going through the documentation order with Margaret Sills and the attorney Margaret had connected them with, a woman named Frances Hale, who had practiced territorial law for 12 years and who had read Eliza's preparation materials and said, "You've done most of my job for me," in a tone that was not entirely complimentary and not entirely not. The Valley Ranchers filled most of the public benches. Jim Holt was there with his wife. Danvers came with Martha, who had put on her good coat. Thomas Reyes brought his 2 sons. Clara Dobbins sat in the back with her father, whose hands shook a little when he sat down, but who had come, which was what mattered. Ruth Candler was there, which surprised Eliza until she thought about it, and then it didn't surprise her at all. Ed Farley was there. He had come back from Oregon the week before, thinner than Caleb remembered him, and with something careful in his eyes that Caleb recognized as the look of a man who had made a choice that cost him and was still deciding whether it had been worth it. He shook Caleb's hand for a long time and said, "I should have stayed." And Caleb said, "You couldn't have known." And Ed said, "I knew enough." And they left it there because some things don't get resolved by talking, just acknowledged. Crow's legal team was 4 men, which told Eliza something. 4 lawyers was expensive. 4 lawyers was a man who was worried and throwing money at the worry the way men like Crow did when the procedural angles had run out. Frances Hale was one woman who knew the file better than anyone in the room. The hearing took most of the day. The judge was a man named Harrington, 60 years old, who had the reputation, Margaret had briefed Eliza on this, of reading every document in a case before the hearing rather than during it, and whose questions were consequently precise and rarely asked twice. He asked Eliza 3 questions directly, which was unusual in a proceeding where she was not technically the attorney of record, and he asked them with the neutral attention of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something rather than performing inquiry. The first was about the chain of custody of the 1858 document, how it had moved from her grandfather to her mother to her, and whether there had been any period in which it was not in direct family possession. She answered it completely and accurately, including the 6 months after her mother died when the letters had been in a solicitor's custody in St. Louis before she had claimed them. The second was about the nature of the co-signatory relationship, what specifically it bound, and whether the Mercer corroboration was an independent verification or a derivative one. She explained the distinction clearly, citing the original language. The third was, "Mrs. Mercer, the original document was removed from the land office. You continued with a copy. Why were you confident the copy would hold?" She thought about this for a moment. not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to say it correctly. "Because my mother taught me that the important thing about a document is not the paper," she said. "It's whether the truth it describes actually happened. The paper can be taken. The truth can't." She paused. "My grandfather and Eli Mercer signed that agreement in 1858. That happened. 30 years of my mother's letters describing its significance happened. The copy is the same truth on different paper." Harrington looked at her for a moment. Then he made a note. Crow's lawyers argued procedural objection, authentication challenge, retrospective survey methodology. Every angle Fitch had already tried, and one new one involving the 1874 statute that Eliza had preemptively addressed in the written submission. Harrington listened to all of it with the same neutral attention and asked 2 questions of Crow's lead attorney that suggested he had read that statute more carefully than the attorney had. The ruling came on Thursday morning by written notice. Margaret Sills brought it to the boarding house where Eliza and Caleb were staying, and she knocked on the door at 7 in the morning and held out the envelope without saying anything, and Eliza took it and opened it and read it. The co-signatory claim was upheld. The 1858 grant was recognized as establishing primary rights on the Harlan Creek water source. The Harlan Creek Water and Land Company's 3 registered filings were reclassified as secondary claims. The November water allocation vote was formally voided, and the committee was required to begin a new process under the corrected rights framework. Senator Aldrich Webb's committee appointment was referred for ethics review based on the undisclosed family relationship with the registered company agent. Silas Crow was named as respondent in a separate proceeding related to the criminal complaint from the Pruitt arrest and the rancher's affidavits. Victor Ashford's name did not appear in the ruling because he had, in the end, not filed anything under his own name. He had worked through Crow and Fitch in a structure that kept him 1 layer removed. This was careful, and it meant that the ruling did not touch him directly. Eliza understood this. She had understood it was possible since the moment in October when he had not come back to the valley. She would deal with that separately, not today. She handed the ruling to Caleb and watched him read it. He read it twice, the way he read things that mattered. Then he set it on the table and looked at it without saying anything for a moment. "Ed Farley," he said. "The sale contestation is now significantly stronger," she said. "Francis Hale thinks with this ruling as supporting precedent and the Pruitt conviction, when it comes, he has a real case. Can he come home?" "I think so. Eventually." She looked at the ruling. "It won't be fast. Nothing about this has been fast." He nodded. They went home 2 days later, on a Saturday morning train, with the December cold settled hard over the territory and the mountains white above the valley and the sky. The particular blue that only happened in winter this far north, clear and absolute and without warmth, but very beautiful. The valley looked different from the train. She had arrived in August, and the grass had been dry gold and the mountains had been distant. Now the grass was gone under the first snow and the mountains were close, the way they always seemed closer in winter, and the creek was still moving under a skin of ice at its edges, and the ranch houses were visible from the train with their smoke coming up straight in the cold air. She could see, from the window, the dark line of the east fence, where Caleb's men had repaired the cut section. She could see, further east, the outline of Ed Farley's abandoned ranch house, which was still standing, which was something. Caleb was asleep beside her, which she had not expected. He had not slept well the 2 nights in Helena, the unfamiliar bed and the unfamiliar city and the waiting, which was its own kind of exhausting. He was asleep now with his head tipped back against the seat and his hands in his lap, and he looked asleep like the letter he had written, exactly as much as he was and no more. A man who had no talent for loneliness and had been practicing it a long time and was, now, practicing something else instead. She looked at him for a while and then looked back at the valley coming toward them through the window. She thought about what she had come here with and what she had now and the distance between them, which was not the distance she had expected. She had come with a document and a problem and a plan. She had the document still, filed now in the territorial court, where it was as permanent as human institutions could make anything. She had solved the problem, provisionally, in the way that real problems got solved. Not cleanly, not completely, but well enough that the people who depended on the solution could build something on it. What she had not come with and had now was harder to put in legal language. She had a husband who read things twice when they mattered. She had neighbors who had sat at her kitchen table and told the true version of hard things because she had asked them to. She had a woman who had noticed blood on her sleeve on the first morning and held a document in a strong box and come to a courthouse in December because she thought it mattered. She had a young woman who had walked in the dark to warn strangers and been useful in every way she had been allowed to be. She had a valley that was still there. There is a thing that people say about starting over, about second chances, about beginning again in a new place with new people. And the thing they say is usually about leaving something behind. Eliza had not left anything behind. She had carried everything. The letters, the years, her mother's voice reading documents at bedtime, the weight of a fight she had not chosen but had never seriously considered not fighting. She had carried all of it west on a train and walked off a platform with blood on her sleeve and a pistol in her coat and a man trying to pull her backward. And she had found, not been given, not stumbled into, but found through sustained daily work, a place that was hers. That was the thing nobody told you about belonging somewhere. It wasn't given and it wasn't inherited, and it wasn't the consequence of showing up. It was built, the way everything worth having in this country was built, out of hard work and good decisions and some luck, and the willingness to stand in front of people you didn't know yet and tell them the truth and ask them to trust it. She had done that. So had Caleb. So had Clara and Ruth and Jim Holt and Martha Danvers and Thomas Reyes and Ed Farley, who was coming home. The train slowed for Harlan Creek, and Caleb woke the way he woke, immediately, without disorientation, already present. He looked out the window. Home, he said, not with any particular emotion, just as a fact, the way you state things that are simply true. Home, she said. Ruth Candler was on the platform, which was either coincidence or she had found out the train time somehow, and Eliza thought it was probably not coincidence. She was standing near the wagon road with her coat buttoned against the cold, and she looked at them coming off the platform and said, "Well?" "We won," Eliza said. Ruth Candler nodded once, as though she had expected nothing else, which was the highest compliment she was likely to give. "Clara's been keeping the document safe," she said. "You can have it back now, I suppose." "Keep it," Eliza said. "For now. I trust your strongbox more than I trust the next 6 months." Ruth looked at her for a moment with something that might have been approval. "Come by the store when you have time. I've been thinking about what happens to the water allocation going forward, and I have some ideas." "I'll come Monday," Eliza said. They drove home in the cold, Caleb with the reins and Eliza beside him with the satchel and the ruling and the long, clear December sky above the valley. The dog ran out from under the porch, and the smoke from the chimney meant the hired hand had kept the fire going, and the mountains were white, and the creek was half-iced, and the east fence was repaired, and the land was exactly what it had been, which was enough. They ate supper that night without talking much about any of it, which was right. There would be months of work still. The new water allocation process, the Pruitt proceeding, Francis Hale pursuing Ed Farley's contestation, the ethics review that would eventually cost Webb his committee seat, the long, slow process of a valley reorganizing itself around a fair arrangement. There would be difficulties they couldn't foresee, and setbacks they would have to absorb, and days when the whole thing felt too large for the people trying to hold it. That was how it always was with anything real. After supper, Caleb sat with the tin box on his lap, the one with his grandfather's documents, and went through it slowly, the way you go through something you've had for years and never properly examined. He took each paper out and looked at it and put it down and looked at the next one. Eliza washed the dishes and watched him from the corner of her eye. He found something near the bottom of the box and was quiet for a long time, and she dried her hands and came to see what it was. It was a letter, short, in handwriting that was older and more formal than Caleb's, addressed to a woman named Clara, not Clara Dobbins, but some other Clara, long ago. And the letter said, among things she didn't read because they were private, "I have put my name on a document today that I hope will matter to someone someday, though I don't know who or when. I did it because it seemed right, and because right things should be documented even when nobody is watching." Caleb looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it and put it back in the box and closed the lid. "Your grandfather knew," Eliza said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe he just did the right thing, and the rest came from that." He set the box aside. Either way, it held. She sat down across from him. She thought about a man in 1858 who had signed a document because it seemed right, and about a woman who had kept letters for 30 years, and about the specific way that right things, properly documented, had a life of their own that outlasted the people who created them. She thought about what she wanted to build in the years ahead. Not just the legal architecture of the water rights or the practical running of the ranch or the community relationships that would sustain this valley through the next generation of challenges. She meant the smaller, dailier things. The kitchen table in the evenings, the way Caleb read things twice, the dog under the table, the particular quality of a life shared with someone who did not require you to be less than you were in order to make room for them. "I want to write to the marriage agency," she said. He looked at her. "Not to—" She stopped. "I want to tell them to keep his letter on file. For anyone who asks." She looked at him. "It was the most useful letter I ever read." His face did the thing it did when he felt something and was deciding whether to say it. He decided not to, which was also what she expected and which was fine because she could see it on him, and that was enough. Outside, the wind had died and the valley was very quiet under its first snow, the kind of quiet that happened only in winter nights in open country, when the cold sat on everything and the stars were very clear and the distance between one ranch house light and the next felt both enormous and somehow not as far as it used to be. There are people who look at a woman and see her size before they see her, who look at a large woman and decide, before she has opened her mouth or done a single thing in front of them, what she is capable of, what she deserves, what she should settle for. Eliza Voss had been looked at that way her whole life and had spent a significant portion of that life being furious about it, which was reasonable, and a smaller portion understanding that the fury was energy and energy could be directed, which was useful. She had directed it west. She had directed it into 30 years of her mother's letters and an 1858 agreement and a territorial court ruling that now lived in a permanent record in Helena, alongside the names of her grandfather and Eli Mercer and everyone who had added their testimony to the truth of what had happened in this valley. She had directed it into a life that was not what anyone looking at her on that train platform would have predicted. And the thing she knew, the thing that was worth saying, even quietly, even just to the walls of a kitchen where a man was closing a tin box and a dog was settling under the table and the fire was going down to coals, was that the people who had looked at her and seen only her size had not been seeing the wrong thing exactly. They had just been reading it wrong. She was large. She took up space. She was built for carrying things, for standing firm, for not being moved by winds that moved other people. She had been built exactly right for the fight she had been given and the country she had come to and the life she was going to make in it. The lamp burned low. The valley held its cold silence. Caleb got up to put another log on the fire, and the dog shifted, and Eliza Mercer, she had started thinking of herself that way, without deciding to, looked at the satchel on the chair, and the ruling on the table, and the kitchen that was hers now as much as anyone's, and she thought, it held. Whatever came next, this part had held. That was enough to build on. That had always been enough.